Father Tony Flannery sent out a tweet saying that he blamed, in part, John Paul II for Trump's success because of John Paul's championing of the culture wars. Now, as somebody who sued John Paul II, I thought that was a bit harsh. I thought there's a lot of bad things that John Paul II was responsible for, but I thought laying the whole nature of the culture wars on him was a little bit problematic, even though I could see where Tony Flannery was coming from. But post that, and even in the run-up to that election, and post Brexit, and all of those other big moments that we're told are huge shocks to our collective understanding of how the world operates, it seems to me that people have been running around trying to grasp for an explanation as to why this has happened, which on one level is fair enough. But every time I hear an explanation, I kind of think, what we're hearing isn't necessarily new. And actually, most of the time what people are doing is looking for a reason why they can use what's happened to fit a convenient narrative that they've developed that helps them to tell a story that they've decided is absolutely true, regardless of the fact. So, for instance, the whole notion of culture wars and a big debate or discussion that's developing now around the whole idea of identity politics. Identity politics, it would appear, is the reason why the liberal left, the progressive liberal elites have lost the run of themselves because they've lost connection with real people. So identity politics is the big problem. And this is an invention of progressive liberalism, which is bullshit. I mean, identity politics is as old as Julius Caesar. You know, tribalism is so much part of how we've organized ourselves and how we've fought and created and defeated empires. And actually, if we look at it in the US context, well, identity politics, you know, what was white supremacy but identity politics? What was segregation but identity politics? What was apartheid but identity politics? The notion that somehow identity politics seen through a progressive lens is a recent invention seems really problematic. And then the other thing that we hear all of the time, and it's been fascinating to, as people try and unstrip the notion of this post-truth reality. When were we in a truth reality? So when did we have, you know, rock solid kind of public discourse where we could trust the things that people said, even politicians and others, or even frankly the media? When could we trust it? Now I get that we're in a different place and we're at a different scale of things. But for instance, the idea that social media is responsible for all of our ills, that, you know, what we have on there is vitriolic extremist debate, where both sides to a debate, this is sounding familiar to anybody in relation to anything that we're talking about in Ireland at the moment, crowd out rational, reasonable debate and shout each other down. And that's what we hear from the great and the good all of the time, particularly from mainstream media. And yet actually, we're living in a time when that tendency to talk about or to seek to engage in really important issues that affect all of us, individually, in our little groups, in our big groups collectively, aren't being dealt with appropriately or properly in terms of how mainstream media deals with it. I mean, let's take an example, for instance, that's linked to Trump. Now, I'm not saying that the Late Late Show is the perfect example of mainstream Irish social discourse, but it's had a really important role in social discourse in this country for all of its history. What did the Late Late Show do to respond to the Trump phenomenon? Brought fucking Katie Hopkins over to appear on the Late Late Show to tell us how this came about and what that meant. What was that? I mean, if somebody did that online, we'd say it was clickbaiting or trolling. So mainstream media has been creating this kind of cheap, empty, vacuous kind of adversarial, confrontational, competition-based discourse that really is part of what happens in social media spaces. And I think for all of us who are concerned about progressive issues, or social justice issues, or social issues, or issues that are grounded in some understanding of our individual and therefore common and collective humanity, we really need, I think, to step back from all of that stuff and think about how we're engaging in conversation generally. And I think the first thing we have to say is, frankly, never mind screw the culture wars, fuck the culture wars. Like this stuff, if people want to reduce debate down to some macho bullshit competition of ideas where we'll give the other fella a bloody nose so that we win and we look good, I'm not interested in that conversation. Like the issues that we need to talk about, the kinds of issues that we're told politics and public discourse is meant to be about, they're not for ideological masturbation. You know, they're not for intellectual self-aggrandizement and pretentious bullshit debate, or just for unpicking and because it's interesting to do so. These are issues that are about people's lives. These are life and death issues. The issues that we're concerned about deserve a better kind of discourse than that kind of discourse. So where does that leave us? Where we have a media or a public narrative that wants to see everything in that oppositional way. And I think it leaves us in a place where we need to disengage from that bullshit and start doing it differently. And interestingly, I think if we look to our own relatively recent history, we'll understand how that might work. I mean, in my experience of being involved in processes that, without me knowing they necessarily would became about big change moments. Like in 1994, when I decided I needed to do something about the fact that I'd been raped and abused by a teenager as a priest. That led me in 1995 to go back and report that to the guards. And as I reported that, I thought it was just me reporting what this one bad man had done to me. But within 18 months, I found myself in a position where I was making a decision to sue the Pope, to sue the Diocese of Ferns, and ultimately then to come back to Ireland and try and force out the first public proper investigation into the role of the state and the church in how they responded to the scandal of child sexual abuse in Catholic dioceses in these countries, in this country. All of that came about from a need to ask questions. It didn't come about from a need to win. It didn't come about from a need to give anybody else a bloody nose. And it absolutely came about from a place where, it's not that I pre-thought any of this stuff out, but when I asked these questions, it was because there were questions that I thought really needed to be asked. And yeah, I was pissed off. I was really, really angry about what I was discovering. But actually, what was more important than me being able to exercise my anger was to try and find out what it was that had gone on. So when I approached, and again, I'm due no credit for this, because it wasn't thought out, it wasn't strategic, it was just how I found myself in those moments. When I started those conversations, it wasn't to prove that I was right, it was to try and find out what it was that was going on. And when I talked about the things that we needed to change, I talked about we, all of us. And it seems to me that if we're concerned with issues that are about social justice, about building decent societies, about women's rights, about repealing the Eighth Amendment, about ending rank gross equality, about getting to grips with the scourge that is, for instance, suicide and really appalling responses to mental health in this country. The first time I made a public speech in my life was 14. When I talked about the need to close down big old Victorian psychiatric institutions, I focused on St. Senan's in Enniscorthy in Wexford, where I grew up, near where I grew up. Move forward like 34 years later, and one of the first things I'm talking about in amnesty is the need to close down St. Senan's in Enniscorthy and Wexford. These are the things that we need to talk about, and that in talking about them, we need to take collective ownership of them and work out how it is that we're going to change them. It's not about beating the other guy. It's about being who we might be. It's not about winning some competition of ideas so that we can be right. It's about trying to find out what it is that is right. And for the macho keyboard warriors, be they sitting behind their screens at home or on their smartphones or sitting, frankly, behind desks writing legislation or newspaper columns or whatever else that they're doing, let's let them get the fuck on with it and leave them to it, because we have really important work and conversations to have. We have things that we have to get to grips with. And if we do that, things change. My experience absolutely was, from 1995 on, was that if we come forward, if we try to engage people in an honest conversation about what we believe to be wrong, in an inquiring, open-minded way, people engage with that, and the change that's necessary happens. And the worst thing that progressives now can do, the worst thing that progressive liberals can do, is continue to buy in to the notion that we're in a battle for some kind of intellectual supremacy with the tiny minority of those who've managed to manipulate the debate to somehow present that those concerned with issues around social justice, progressive values, or equality are an elite. And those who, I mean, talk about an Orwellian trick. You know, when you see what's happened in the US in the last couple of months, it's an obvious thing for me to say, but I have to say it. The notion that Donald Trump, a billionaire of inherited wealth, managed to position himself in a way that he was the defender of the marginalized and working class in the US is quite the trick. And it's one that there's no point in us, for instance, simply, it's easy to go after him. It's easy. It's easy even to go after those around him. And I don't mean that we don't have to challenge the hateful, vile rhetoric that's spouted in the main by those around him, and in my view, ignorantly and for nothing other than populist reasons by him. We have to challenge those ideas, but we have to challenge them in a way that's stepping back from the notion that this is some blood sport or some contest, or that feeds into the idea that this is about, as I started off with all of this, some kind of culture war. So the conversations that we have to have mean that we have to turn away from that rhetoric, from that empty process, and really start to engage each other in a collective way. And I'll finish this bit of it on this point. We know what that means here. Now we're a small state, a small society, a small republic. But just think about the role that identity politics, or actually a concern for notions of equality and social justice, if we want to call it that. Think about what that's done for our public discourse, for who we are as a people, for who we are as a republic. May 2015, in a moment where we as a republic got to decide who we were and what we stood for, where we could proclaim some sense of our collective values when it comes to principles like equality. On the issue of same-sex marriage, look what we did. It was the most extraordinary thing. We took an issue that in many other places would have been about minority interests. And something happened here where we had a conversation where it didn't become just about those of us who might want to marry somebody of the same gender. It became about all of us. That vote wasn't about whether or not we would allow two people of the same gender to get married. It was about all of us. And we all cared passionately about that idea. And not because it was some, over-romanticized notion of lovely weddings, and sure, the gay weddings would be fabulous, won't they? Actually, have you seen some of the pictures? They really aren't. The notion that we all have fabulous fashion sense. Anyway, it hasn't really worked out like that, to our collective shame. But like the idea that that's what this would be about was nonsense. And interestingly, for those of us who were, and there's people in this room who are very actively involved in that campaign, and many that I'm sure I haven't met who were very involved in that campaign as well. For those of us who were heading into that, we learned very early on, because we did the work to identify what people were concerned about. I'll give you an example. The notion of love was not a compelling point upon which people would vote, funnily enough. Like, love matters. Why can't you marry the person that you love? That wasn't the basis upon which people wanted to engage. What did people engage on? What was the issue that got people not just hooked, but massively invested? The notion of equality, of generosity, of decency, of caregiving. You could say love in its broadest possible sense, which I would quite like to do, but it wasn't about the notion of romantic love. It was about notions of generosity and fairness and decency and equality. And in that moment, in that conversation, we defied not just the world's expectation of who we might be and who Ireland was. We also defied the expectations of all of those who tell us all of the time what we think, how we will respond to ideas, whether we're capable of having conversations about complex ideas, particularly moral or challenging issues. We defied all of those expectations. The one most fascinating thing for me, I would, if I keep talking, I'll come up with another number of most fascinating things for me about the marriage equality referendum. But one of the remarkable things for me was how quickly the history got rewritten the day after the result. If you go back and look at particularly popular media coverage of the marriage equality referendum, even right throughout the campaign, it presented a very different picture to what was actually happening on the ground, right? So in the run-up to that campaign, we were told, this is going to be a really toxic, divisive debate. It's going to be horrible. It's going to be horrid. And you're going to have these extreme positions, and they're all going to be horrible stuff happening online, and it's going to be really, really nasty. Now, the Yes campaign in that referendum was really disciplined about calling people out when they behaved in a way that was unacceptable. But actually, the campaign was, and the engagement was really quite joyful and positive and uplifting. It was tough. It was difficult being out there defending your life, defending your your family, defending your intimate relationships, and ask people to approve of them. That's a tough thing to have to do. But the response from people was quite extraordinary. But when you look at the coverage, particularly, for instance, I remember lots of stuff in the Irish Independent saying, where is the Yes campaign? There's none out there. Or suggesting the campaign was sneery and disengaged, or lots of people saying how this was a minority issue, and it's fine for those up in Dublin talking about these kinds of issues, but in rural areas this doesn't really matter. I remember Roland Mullen predicting 2 areas where people wouldn't be concerned about this at all. They returned overwhelmingly yes votes in that, just to spite him, I hope, more than anything else. But we were told how we would approach this conversation, and how we would engage and relate to each other, and we defied those expectations absolutely. And we did it because we came at this from a place of not who is this other person and what should we really do for them, even though we probably don't really want to because we don't care about them. Instead, we came at it from a place where we had a conversation about who we are collectively. And it seems to me that if identity politics matters, the first thing it needs to do is not abandon the idea of that, not abandon the language of identity and the importance of affirming and acknowledging difference in order to recognize the inclusive nature of a really compassionate, decent, solid, strong, self-aware, confident society. But we need to defy those who will tell us that care for minority means a lack of regard for any other group. And we did that here in 2015. So we said, in 2015, screw the culture war. And I think in that regard, there is actually an opportunity for us to lead as a country and as a society now. For whatever reason, we haven't seen, and there are lots of interesting reasons to speculate on it, and not enough time to do it. But for whatever reason, we have not seen the rise of extreme populism in this country, or even semi-extreme populism in this country. That's not to say that there isn't loads of bigotry, loads of misogyny in particular, loads of xenophobia and even racism in this country. It's there, but it hasn't become populist. It doesn't, and I don't think it's just because it doesn't have license, because let's face it, these days, lots of these things have license, and we see plenty of it, for instance, online and in other spaces. We see it there. And it's always asserted itself previously. I can remember the 2002 general election, some really outrageous things being said by candidates in that election, for instance, about refugees and asylum seekers. Now, there are big issues here. I'm not suggesting everything is great, but we've never, for whatever reason, we seem to be moving away from rather than to that place. That's worth talking about. That's worth thinking about. And that's the conversation that I think we should be having, rather than giving into the demand from those who I think quite deliberately want to pull us into a really nasty, vitriolic conversation where it becomes really bloody, in order to be able to maintain ownership of the space. That's over. We need to end that. And instead, we need to move forward and have different kinds of conversations. And I'm going to have to give a shout out for Repeal the 8th, seeing as I'm wearing my Uterus Prime t-shirt. Isn't it fabulous? At Uterus Prime, you can go and get one. All proceeds to the abortion rights campaign, please do. For whom I don't work, my own fundraising team will kill me for this. But you know, as we head into that next conversation, I have to say, I do not for one moment accept that what we're going to have is a horrible, divisive, toxic, nasty public conversation. I think we're going to have a similar experience to the kind of conversation that we had on marriage equality. Very different topic in some ways, but actually, if you think about it, this conversation is, in my view, an even more important conversation about our values, about how we care for each other, about how we provide for each other, about how we address and deal with really everyday, ordinary, complex, challenging, and not challenging, normal realities of our lives and of our reproductivity, in particular, obviously, of women's reproductivity. It'll be that kind of conversation. It can be a bold, positive, affirming conversation, and it will be if we say screw the culture wars and turn around and have conversations with the 80% of people in this country who want to see very significant progress on this issue. Only 5% of people in Ireland are personally opposed to abortion in all circumstances, of whom, by the way, half would vote to repeal the 8th Amendment. That's a really important stat. When we started out on our campaign in Amnesty on abortion in Ireland, we came into this with certain assumptions, and one of them was that there'd be a significant enough minority who were totally opposed to progress in any way, and there was no point in talking to them because they'd be very fixed in their views. That was a really arrogant, stupid position, frankly, in my view, for us to adopt, because we found out that's not the case. There are many people who have principled objections or concerns or questions about this issue. And what we have to do, I think, is create a space where we can engage with those concerns, engage with those questions, but also understand that even for some who are personally opposed in a lot of circumstances, they would not and cannot countenance a situation where their opposition is imposed on everybody else by force of our constitution or our law. We are better than that. And we are better than the culture wars. And Ireland can be something different. Not because we are better than anybody else, but just because we have that opportunity. So screw the culture wars.